Okay, I hope everyone can see my screen now. We're just about to get started. Lori, Gavin, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, great. So hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this Friday afternoon to learn about offsets and putting some time aside for us. I'm your host, Haley. I'm a senior account executive here at OMX. And I have a couple people here from CFN Consultants, Lori Delaney-Barry and Gavin Scott. And they're going to be taking over most of the presentation, but I'm just going to quickly introduce you to what we're doing today. And I looked through the list of registered attendees, and it's a really great mix of suppliers, contractors, government, and associations, so that's great. Hopefully we get some good questions out of it and we get a good discussion happening at the end. Lori and Gavin are going to be running you through a really condensed version of like a lesson on offsets today. They're a wealth of knowledge. I'm only giving them about 40 minutes to run through what they know. So if you do have questions or if you want to dig deeper into any of the content that they cover, let me know. I will connect you in an email. I think that their email addresses are also available at the end of their presentation. So feel free to reach out and ask them questions, and I'm sure they'll give you the answers that you need. Before we get started, a couple housekeeping items. Like all the webinars that we've done in the past, this one will be recorded as well. I'll put it up on the OMX website, and I'll also send a follow-up email to everyone that registered for today's webinar. So you'll get that and you can share it with whoever you want. Secondly, questions, like I said, if you have one directed towards Lori or towards Gavin, just write them in whenever they pop into your head, and I'll keep track of them and we'll cover them at the end. Just very quickly, I'm going to give you an overview of what we're going to cover. So a little bit about OMX. We do a lot of supplier discovery, data, economic impact reports, data analytics. I'm just going to, quickly touch on us, and then CFN is going to do the bulk of the presentation on offsets and then questions at the end. So this is just a quick screen grab from OMX on the right-hand side. It just gives you an understanding of what you can do and what kind of visuals you can pull from OMX. So this is important and ties into offsets and ITBs and VPs because a lot of the larger contractors use our software to find specific capabilities throughout the country or, North America, what have you. And this is kind of what it looks like. It's like a heat map of where companies are and what they can do. So that's all from me. I'm going to pass it over to Lori. I believe you're going first. So I'm just going to send you an invitation there now, and you can share your screen whenever you're ready.
Oh, Haley, I thought you had the presentation up.
Oh, Gavin does. So I'm just going to, I'll switch it to Gavin then.
Oh, really? Okay.
And Lori, you can still present. Like I know that you still know the content, but Gavin, if you have the presentation up on your screen, then I will let you do the slides. And Lori, you can speak to the slides if you'd like.
Okay. We're gonna have a little bit of a problem because I'm working from a portable, not at my office location, and I had the screen up on another computer, but it's not on this one. So Lori, can you just pop it up and use it?
Yeah. So mine's on my screen, Haley. I don't really know how to share my screen with you.
That's okay. I will do that for you. 1 second. You should get an invitation now.
Can you see?
Yep.
You can see the screen, yeah?
Yep, it's great. You just have to go into presenter view. So slideshow at the top of your screen. Yep. And then click from beginning on the left-hand side. There you go.
Oh, there
Perfect.
we go. Magic. I love it.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself. You can take over, Lori.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Sorry for the slow start, technical difficulties. So today we're going to be talking about ITBs and investments. So the agenda is focused on prime contractors, ITB investment focus, the ITB mandatory eligibility criteria, different types of ITB investments, along with the ITB investment issues, and then I guess Haley's got some time for questions at the end. All right. So first slide. So the first thing to be important is to ensure full compliance of the mandatory eligibility criteria. These criteria will consist of 100% CCV, so the value of the contract has to be done in Canadian dollars. It has to be done in Canada. That's your 100%. Most now you'll see a minimum 15% small medium business requirement. And the small medium business requirement, you've got to note that these are company sizes 250 full-time employees or less, not the standard 500. So it's important to note. There's also sometimes a component for a specific percentage of direct CCV, meaning work placed directly to the contract that you're working on. Okay. Okay, so it must be new work. There's also causality. The benefits have to be demonstrated. The benefits to be demonstrated have to be brought about because of the Prime's ITB obligation to Canada. There's a lot of documentation that needs to be maintained within your organization so that you can demonstrate that to ISED. There's also an achievement period or a period of performance that has to be met. It usually runs 4 to 6 years or runs to about 1 year after contract closeout. It's typical. Also eligible parties. Only the Prime or an eligible Tier 1 are allowed to provide investment transactions. Okay? So the idea with investment transactions is to maximize the Canadian content of your contract. It's also to minimize the risk. So each investment proposal is assessed for risk. It's related to capability to perform and against a company financial stability. Investment transactions can provide multipliers for ITB crediting, but if the transaction fails, the Prime is obligated to replace the total CCV value of the multiplied credit, not just the initial transaction. And another thing to note is when you're submitting bid submission, investment transactions at bid submission are only the base value, not the multiplied value. The multiplied value only comes into play upon contract award. Okay, as well, the technology has to match or be above the technology within the contract. Excuse me, my voice is starting to go. Okay, next slide. So, focusing on the RFP value prop requirements in order to achieve maximum evaluation points to win the bid or to fulfill your value prop. So some of the value prop pillars that you'll typically see are defense, advanced manufacturing, research and development, and exports. And now we're also seeing a couple of other pillars such as skills development and professional development. As well, in these, part of your VP will be to maximize the small business, keeping in mind that it's typically 10% or 15%, I'm sorry. All right, next slide. So eligibility criteria. Again, ITB and value prop transactions must be based on new work that are the same level of technology and, of course, compliant to the eligibility criteria. So getting into the eligibility criteria, you have causality. So demonstrated to be brought about only because of the Prime's ITB obligation to Canada for the contract. The achievement period, again, typically 4 to 6 years or approximately 1 year after the contract closeout, you must have all of your CCV, all of your achievements and your obligations fulfilled by the end of that achievement period. Otherwise, you run the risk of acquiring liquidated damages, which are typically set at about 10% of your default value. Canadian content value, so 100% Canadian content. I believe all contracts moving forward will see this. We've seen in the past some ISS contracts with 70% Canadian content, but I don't see this happening in the future with value proposition. And the Canadian content means that it has to be done in Canada. And just because you're having work performed in Canada or parts made in Canada doesn't mean that part is 100% Canadian content. Some of the material to make that part could have come from offshore, which will skew your Canadian content in the end. So if 50% of your product came from outside of Canada and the rest of it from Canada, only 50% Canadian content is valid for that particular portion of your work. However, there's a caveat with small businesses. I believe it is less than $1 million PO. If your Canadian content is 70% or greater, it will be valued at 100% Canadian content when working with a small, medium business. Now, eligible parties, which are typically the prime contractor and your tier ones, are the only people that are the only companies that are allowed to submit investment transactions against a particular contract. And we have third-party activities, brokering, and swaps are not allowed in Canada. These are sometimes allowed in other countries' offset policies, but currently not allowed in Canada. And there is a note at the bottom here, failure to comply with any of the above criteria will result in the investment being assessed as non-compliant. Therefore, you will have to go back and recreate a new transaction or a new investment or multiple transactions to make up the value that you thought you would be bringing in with the investment transaction. All right. Next slide, different types of investments. So I think this is going to be where most people want to understand the types of investments. So venture capitals, donations to universities, public, private, general. You can see on this slide that there's varying degrees of multipliers for the type of investment that you can make. So an investment type, so a donation to a university is typically a 5-time multiplier. That's giving them cash to establish a chair, a university chair, or cash to do some R&D within a university will get you a 5-time multiplier. So a $500,000 donation gets back a credit of $2.5 million. Consortium transactions, where the prime invests in research and development and commercialization through consortium. The consortium has to consist of the prime or the any one of the tier ones, with a minimum of 1 Canadian company and 1 post-secondary institution or public research institution. Involvement of the non-Canadian companies in the consortium is permitted, but the combined total investment from the non-Canadian companies cannot exceed 50% of the consortium value. Contributions to the consortium can be in the form of cash or in-kind contributions. In the case of in-kind contributions, the values of these shall be determined by an assessment to be undertaken by a third party to the contract at the contractor's cost. The future sales that may arise from that consortium will not be counted for ITB credit within the consortium transaction. Okay. Investment framework is one of the newer ones, and it's where you can get a high amount of return for cash. You can get up to 9 times multiplier. The investment framework transactions are restricted to small, medium businesses. So you must be investing in a small, medium business. They have to involve research and development or commercialization. The technology level, TRL 6 or higher, is good. So investments made directly by the prime to a Canadian small business, and activities must meet all of the following eligibility criteria. So the investment has to be linked to R&D or commercialization. It has to be with a small, medium business. It must meet the ITB eligibility criteria, and it must be an allowable IF investment. As well, the IF activity has to have a duration of at least 5 years, beginning at the date of the investment, and a complete business plan has to be submitted to the ITB authority. Okay, so typically here you can get a 9 times multiplier for cash for R&D activities or license for IP. You can get a 7-time multiplier for cash to purchase or in-kind transfer of equipment, or a 4-time multiplier for an in-kind transfer of knowledge and or marketing or sales support. Okay. General investments, potential for higher risk due to the potential of underachieving sales projections within the actual ITB achievement period or period of performance. They typically provide a 1-for-1 credit to the prime's initial investment amount, but there is the potential of substantial crediting returns on the CCB for the downstream sales, especially over an achievement period of 7 to 10 years or longer. So an example is a $1 million initial investment. You'll get your 1-for-1 on that $1 million, but your downstream sales of $50 million with a Canadian content value at 70% at 1-for-1 could give you an additional $36 million. And Gavin, I haven't had a whole lot of experience with venture capital fund transactions. Do you want to talk to that one?
Yeah, just to the point with respect to all of these, we've done a number with a lot of prime contractors. We've done the university. We've done the public-private consortium. In general, we've done a few on to the point where there are much more higher risk profiling in relation to achieving export sales or downstream sales over the achievement period. Investment frameworks we're doing a lot more of because we're trying to focus on the R&D, but the venture capital one, that's been around for a long time. Even back in the old IRG days, you used to have to have an approved venture capital fund to do this. We haven't done any, to my recollection, with any of the primes we've dealt with over the last 10 years. It's one of those where they put the money into a fund and they get the one-time multiplier when the fund goes in, the money goes into the fund, and then there's a potential of getting another multiplier 4 times when the fund disperses it to a small business. But typically, small businesses are, I think, are even smaller than the 250. But back to the multipliers and the returns, and the prime contractor really sort of loses control over the investment when it goes into a fund like that. The primes we deal with haven't done that. Some of the other contractors do, because it does still give you a 5-time multiplier. But you note that it's also, your crediting cap is also capped at, I think, about 5% of your overall ITB commitment. So would seem like a good idea to get an easy crediting, but it doesn't give you that much of a return. And those kind of small investments have a tendency to increase the number of transactions that we do. So the answer is no, and I don't see anything in the foreseeable future, although there are some funds that have been established that people use, but there are aspects to it that some primes just don't want to be involved in.
Excellent. Okay.
I think you should note, Laurie, that the investment framework is also capped, and as under the 20 to 25% of your total commitment. That's an important issue because small businesses are hard to do internally within the overall ITB aspect of it. And it's a good idea to develop technology and liquidate our R&D commitments. But Industry Canada at one time was a lot lower. I think it was somewhere around 5 or 10%, and has now been moved up to 25, which is really good, and provides a really good opportunity for a lot of small business, especially in technology development and commercialization, that did not exist a few years ago. Over to you.
Okay, so I'm switching over to the last slide, number 7, Gavin, and I'll let you. I'll let you just get on that.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, one of the issues, well, the key issue for any potential recipient is the access and engagement with the prime contractor, or as Laurie mentioned, the tier 1 donor. I mean, you have to go back to the slide. I mean, what is the prime's motivation here? There's in relation to doing an IRB or ITB transaction or an investment. He's trying to maximize his Canadian content return to liquidate his commitment obligations in the contract. That Laurie mentioned 10% liquidated damages for underachieved amounts. It's really an important issue. So what we end up doing in relation to especially in the investment transactions, is one, to look at, okay, how do we want to do it? But the first step we look at is trying to match the technology development that a prime or a tier 1 donor might be looking at over the next 2 years. And if we can get some sort of technology match in working with the potential company or small business or whatever it is, then that's a high motivator internally within the company to maybe do some sort of an investment. Or alternatively, we would look at doing investments in relation to liquidating the obligations for these value proposition commitments. I don't know, I gather most people understand that this value proposition is a new requirement by the government. It's being implemented as a consequence of the Defense Production procurement strategy, and KIC is involved with these key industry sectors, etc. Key thing for bidders and primes is that it is now becoming a major component in the selection of winning bidders on all RFPs to varying degrees. And secondarily, they're starting to identify a liquidated damage of about 20% on the obligations after you've committed to it in your contract. So clearly, with the R&D becoming a new component of the value propositions and supplier development and export, utilizing investments is a really neat way of mitigating some of the risk in the contract and liquidating some of the commitments that we have. And I think I said it before, but historically, I would say that small business has been 10 or 15% mandatory requirement over the years, and it's one of the harder ones we have to do. So we're back to I think that prime contractors and tier 1s are motivated to do this for various reasons, but for companies to identify their technology and try and work with the prime and getting the prime to understand what you do is almost the hard part. So, and that requires work on with your business development people in accessing the offset people within each particular project file. Now, the second bullet really goes down to some of the points I made earlier. Very few investments are done prior to contract award. And the reason for that is typically in the investment, we have to match the technology. We have to get approval internally within the prime that we want to do this. And there's a timeline involved in doing it, which doesn't really fit in well to the 3 to 6 months for RFPs, notwithstanding the combat ship, which was what, about 6 years or something like that. So that's part of the reason we don't do it. Plus of the risk profiling that Laurie mentioned earlier. If they invest the money and the investment goes south, we don't get the crediting, it has to be replaced, and in fact the prime loses its investment dollars. And the question really comes from, and you have to understand, where does the investment money come from? Typically, in most primes, the major primes will set aside what I call an ITB investing funding pot. Some don't. Some have to drag that out of their operating costs or development costs, or alternatively their profits. So you can understand the risk profiling when it gets to, okay, doing an investment and how much. It all rotates back to maximizing the return. As mentioned, the downstream sales model gives you the highest return, but it has the highest risk profile. So we have to balance all of that off. Back to my point about almost none. I've only done 1 or 2 that have been done with the bid when it goes in. The timeline for the initial engagement with the prime through to ISET approval can exceed a year. We've had some go longer than that, but those were some of the initial investment framework ones we put in. In other words, we were breaking new ground. They're starting to be internally within the government more expeditious in their approval process. I think there's more of an understanding of what's allowable and not allowable. But the timeline for engagement with the prime or tier 1 kicks down almost with the next bullet. It goes back to what do you got? What do you want? Okay, then putting together some sort of an executive summary and get the offset people to buy in and disperse it internally within the prime's technical organization. Then we have business plans which have to be developed, which you're all familiar with, I assume. But it's more focused on what are you going to use the money for? And I should go back a little bit. The investments that we've done with most of the primes are not in relation to ownership, equity, share, ownership of IP. They've been basically in the form of a grant. So you can understand, I think, how or why the primes want to have fairly detailed business plans, especially if we're looking at downstream sales. There's a rigorous due diligence process. We have offset project agreements, MOUs that have to be put in place. All is part of the overall process. And then because they're giving away money, to use the expression, there's what I call a fairly rigorous bureaucratic process internally within the primes to get approval on this, because they marry off the risk in relation to the crediting they're going to get. And then from the recipient's point of view, there's another issue that you have to look at. Well, how much money do I want? How am I going to apply it? And that all has to be exposed to the government. And then there are, as a follow-on to that, believe it or not, if you get a grant as one of these investments, the Canadian CRA doing his due diligence will come at you for income tax. And it's kind of bizarre, but they do that. There are shred issues in relation to how you structure your business plan and your project agreement in relation to deliverables or non-deliverables of technology. And then there are, in some cases, requirements for letters of credit, which the recipient has to fund. So going all the way back to, okay, how do we engage with a prime? You have to put together a synopsis of a technology which you believe is going to be realistic, and then explain to the prime why and how you think it's beneficial to them. And then we have to go through all the processes to the bottom line, which is not there, in getting approval from the government. which again we do. But investments are really beneficial to primes. It helps them a great deal, especially with the value propositions, mitigating the risk of liquidated damages being imposed as a consequence of some of these new value propositions. But in summary, they're, I won't say hard to do. They're a little difficult to begin the process, but then it becomes a very rigorous, detailed process to go through and get the investment approved. But we have a number of companies who are very, very happy with the money when they finally get the check. We've seen investments, give you a sense of the type of investments. We've seen investments with the primes we're doing in all the value proposition categories. We've looked at computer software, computer development, health, cyber technology, aerospace, ELIR technologies, right across the broad spectrum. And we've seen investments in the range of 500,000 up to potentially 10 million. So I guess that's a bit of a summary there. I guess if there's any questions, we can try and answer those.
Yeah, Gavin and Lori, just a couple things. So I just wanted to chip in something. Lori, you mentioned about Canadian content value and how if raw materials were from outside of the country, they wouldn't necessarily contribute to having 100% Canadian content value. For anyone that's on the webinar right now that is registered on OMX, if you go to your profile on your dashboard, there is a section where you can add a product or service, and there's a Canadian content calculator that's included as part of the OMX software. So if there's something that you wanted to take a stab at and see what percentage it is, you can just plug it in, follow the boxes that pop up. It's really, really simple, and it'll spit out your Canadian content value. Okay, so I have a question that was written in. Gavin and Lori, I'm not sure which one of you want to take this, but I guess either of you can speak up. So can a supplier to a tier 1 be approved as an eligible party and offer indirects to provide 100% Canadian content value? So I guess, can a supplier to a tier 1, so can a tier 2 supplier be approved as an eligible party and offer indirects to provide 100% CCV?
There have been cases where Tier 2 has been approved. It has to be approved in advance in writing by ISED, and you'll have to make a case as to why that Tier 2 supplier would be required as an eligible party on that contract.
Right.
Just to add to that, I mean, each individual project prime contract does a little different profiling with respect to flow down to tier 1s, tier 2s, tier 3s. In the past, it used to get flowed down a long way down. Now, Industry Canada recently has sort of capped it off at tier 1s. You want to go farther, you have to get approval. But we have some primes that do not flow it down. They do it all themselves. We have some primes that flow it all the way down. And that's because, especially if I have an off-the-shelf system like an airplane that has an embedded supply chain, flowing it down to your tier 1 suppliers just increases the cost and the overall bid proposal. So there's a number of rationales for doing it and not doing it. I'm not sure a tier 2 or tier 3 should step up to the plate because there's additional risk involved in taking on obligations.
Okay, great. I think that answers our question. We might dive into it again if that person has a follow-up. So we have a second one here. Will primes work with small to medium-sized businesses, and then in brackets it says, as part of their 15% component, with startup companies for investment frameworks, and has this been done before? I'll read it again. Will primes work with small to medium-sized enterprises with startup companies for investment framework, and has this been done before?
The answer is yes, yes, and yes. As a matter of fact, we've taken it to a further step where I'll give you an example. The first step, we go to university, we develop a technology, maybe a software algorithm. We may buy some technology as part of a consortium, for example, a quantum computer. We disperse that back to the university. They develop a new technology or business line. And then what happens is that the prime will invest in a brand new startup for technology that never existed before. That's one process.
Great. And
so,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and they've also done that in relation to companies that are starting up new technologies.
Great, and there's a follow-up from the same participant. Are most investment framework investments based on technology products, or are there any service-based or industry development investments that have been done?
In the past, well, I can only go from my experience. I'm not sure that it would preclude like the in-service support component and things like that, but most of them have been focused on technology, because the part of the problem is going to Industry Canada and explaining to them what R&D really means around the development of a technology and the commercialization of it. If I have a specific technology product, it's easier to do. And it's more important, by the way, on a downstream sale, because if we don't tag the technology, we can't get the downstream sales. Right. So there's a potential, but we'd have to look at the details first.
Right. Okay. Great. And I want to make another comment. We talked about, Gavin touched on KICs very briefly when we talked about market segments. For anyone that's listening, we did do a webinar recently in cooperation with Avocent. We were subcontracted to just host webinars and do a little bit of work there. But they did make a recording of that webinar. So if anyone's interested in hearing a little bit more detail about key industrial capabilities and what that's all about, I can make that available as well. So just speak up if that's something that you're interested in. I think that's it for questions right now, unless someone else wants to write something in, but I think we've answered most of them. If there's something else you want to cover very quickly, Gavin or Lori?
No, I don't think so. I mean, this is just one component of the ITB investment. Is only one component of the overall big portfolio for ITB. So there's probably more to follow.
Yeah, I'm sure that we could probably do a few more webinar sessions just on breaking down the various pieces. Yep. 1 second. We do have another question. I think he's probably just typing it now. So maybe just give 1 minute and we'll get into it. But we could probably do another follow-up webinar in a month's time, and we can go over another portion of a part of ITBs and VPs. Oh, okay. So I have it here now. If you submit a request for a transaction and it gets declined due to insufficient information, can you resubmit?
The answer is yes.
Okay.
And let's put it this way. Back to, if we're dealing with investment transactions, that's another reason why we would do it after contract award, because when we sit down and we negotiate and develop the transaction in partnership with the government versus just doing it and throwing it across the wall with an RFP. Okay.
Oh, and we got another one. So in regards to the NSPS program, how is the CCV ITB consideration weighted in the yards purchasing program? They can choose.
You mean the value prop?
Yeah, that's a different value prop. That's a standalone, and it's between the yards, and I believe it was based on economic development for the shipyards themselves.
Okay, and it says they can choose 100% foreign and make up credits in other areas, question mark. I'm just reading it right off the screen, so if you guys want to discuss. Yeah, so, okay, I'll read the thing in the whole message in its entirety, and then we can break it down. So it says, in regards to the NSPS program, how is the CCV ITB consideration weighted in the yards purchasing program? And then it says, they can choose 100% foreign and make up their credits in another area, question mark. So can they choose 100% foreign and make up credits in another area?
Well, I guess that would depend on the RFP at hand. How much is there a direct CCV component? to
Yeah,
it.
it's different every time,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and also the value proposition component, the equation for bid selection is a little bit different on that particular program. The combat ship value proposition, I believe, is 75% technical, 25% value proposition. But back to Laurie's point, the foreign content is going to be what's acceptable and not acceptable is driven by the direct component.
Yeah.
And I think that was a sole source negotiation versus a competitive environment.
Okay. And another one just came in. This is great. We're getting lots of engagement. So if a foreign company starts a Canadian subsidiary due specifically to an IRB obligation, can the setup and indirect company costs be considered an IRB transaction?
In other words, self-investing. That's a every RFP I've seen recently, they keep changing the marker on that one. Yes, it's possible, but quite frankly, it's kind of difficult to do. The one thing you have to be careful of is that when a company does that, the Canadian component is not likely going to be a small business. So it kicks it out of the investment framework environment.
Right.
But yes, there's a potential of self-investment, but you have to be very careful up front to try and structure/tailor that to meet the ITB requirements so that you're compliant.
Yeah. I did this with a client a couple of years ago, and we based the sale on a general investment transaction, and it essentially equated to once the future sales hit the value of the sale, we would receive CCV on the delta, the future sales.
And that's a pretty good answer. We've done one on sort of in reverse where we had a company go bankrupt. And we invested in reconstituting the company, and then we were allowed to get the downstream sales, but not the investment in the company.
Right.
Okay, 1 second. We have a couple more. This one's a little bit long. So, okay. So the last slide says ITB investment funding typically comes out of funding for the awarded project. Okay.
Yes.
And then it says, are there any issues with Canada/ISED deeming that an unallowable cost, as Canada usually has an audit clause in the contract? Do you want me to read it again?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm not really sure. Okay.
Okay. So the last slide says, this might be one that we can get back to. I can always forward it to you, and you can get back to them if it gets complicated. So the last slide says ITB investment funding typically comes out of the funding for the awarded project. Okay. Are there any issues with Canada/ISED deeming that an unallowable cost, as Canada usually has an audit clause in the contract?
Well, to start off with, ISED doesn't audit the contract. It's PSPC or PWGSC. And what I mean in the awarded project is the awarded contract, because remember, the prime only gets the money that's under the contract value. So he has to embed someplace an investment fund portfolio as part of his bid costs. So the answer is we've never had anything rejected because it's not necessarily that visible to Public Works. It becomes as a project management cost or out of the profit line.
Okay, I just made a note of that one. So, and sorry, to go back to our question earlier about a company setting up a Canadian office, could it potentially fall under causality then?
Well, I think it's like anything else. We're starting to get in the details of what is and what isn't sort of compliant and that kind of thing. I think we'd have to have a full description of what people are talking about before you can even give an answer. Yeah, in theory, it could be causal simply because you tag it to a project. But when people deal with causality, you don't necessarily have to drag it to a specific project. You may be able to link it to some company's potential upcoming obligations or future obligations in ITBs, or even set up a bank process for banking.
Yeah, there's a whole strategy behind all of this.
Yes, there is.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. I mean, these contractors don't necessarily just come in on a one-off project idea. It's a strategy that's in place.
But the point that's just being made on this one is, I think, underscores the issue that every single investment, whether it fits any one of the criteria or investment in technology, you have to sit down and strategically position each individual one so that it does become compliant and maximizes the return of the prime. So every one has to be dealt with as its own little story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great point. I think that's it for questions. I haven't seen any else come in. So I think that's it, unless someone wants to try and slip one in before the bell here. But other than that, Lori, Gavin, you guys have been awesome. Lori, is there anything else you wanted to add to that? Sorry, I think I heard you speak up for a second.
Back to causality, I just wanted to say, so causality must be new work brought about in part due to a current or anticipated ITB obligation to Canada. Okay?
Yeah. So you can't backtrack after a Canadian office has been set up and say, well, this was because of...
We did it
yeah.
in anticipation of a future obligation or a current obligation. It doesn't have to be specific to the program that you're bidding on.
Right.
Okay. Sorry, just wanted to clear that up.
No, that's good. Yeah, so that's it, I think. Oh, wait. Oh, okay, so we've just had a couple people ask for your contact information, but I have the names written down here, so I will pass that along to you guys on both sides. So Lori and Gavin, I'll send it to you, and then I'll also send it to people that have written in.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much. I really appreciate you guys coming on today. What I'm gathering here is that from the questions is that we could probably do another webinar or two and really dig into it a little bit deeper. So if there is a topic that anyone wants myself, Gavin, and Lori to cover in the future, we usually do them bi-weekly, but we'll probably do another one in a month's time. And if there's any topic that anyone wants to cover, please just email me and we'll have a conversation about it, and we'll probably put something together if that's cool with you guys, with Gavin, Lori.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks so much.
Okay.
And I'll make sure to get everyone a copy of the webinar after. Have a great evening.
Okay.
See you. Have a good weekend.
Thanks
guys.
very much, Julie.
Bye.
You too. Bye.
Bye.